au rôle du calvinisme dans la formation de l'État, son analyse de la discipline, enfin au sens de Lebensführung, dans l'émergence de l'État, mais également plus largement de la modernité, toute sa relecture de Max Weber et d'éthique protestante. Mais aujourd'hui, Philippe Gorski va nous parler de quelque chose de très différent, qui est le nationalisme, le christianisme nationaliste blanc aux États-Unis, un sujet dont il est inutile de souligner l'actualité. La réunion a été pour l'essentiel organisée avec naturellement toute l'équipe d'Anso et de l'Institut par Aditya, qui est le chef du département d'anthropologie. Donc je lui passe immédiatement la parole pour présider et modérer cette séance. Merci encore Philippe de votre présence.
Thank you, Jean-François. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Yves Oltramare Chair, it is a true pleasure to welcome you all to this special event featuring a distinguished scholar whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of religion, politics, and society, Professor Philip Gorski. Professor Gorski is the Frederick Laura Goff Professor of Sociology at Yale University, where his research explores the deep and complex relationships between religion, nationalism, and democracy. A renowned historical sociologist, his scholarship bridges past and present, offering keen insights into how collective identities, moral orders, and political movements take shape. His influential books, including American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, and The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism, and The Threat to American Democracy, have sparked vital conversations about the role of religion in public life. Through his work, he challenges us to think critically about the narratives that define nations and communities and to consider the forces that unite and divide societies. Beyond his written scholarship, Professor Gorski is a dedicated educator and public intellectual whose contributions extend far beyond the academy. His work has shaped public discourse and informed contemporary debates on democracy, pluralism, and civic responsibility. We are incredibly fortunate to have him with us today, and I know we will all leave this talk with a deeper appreciation for the forces shaping our present moment. Please join me in welcoming Professor Philip Gorski.
One final technical matter so I can see where the PowerPoint presentation is. Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming this evening to hear about a not very happy subject at a not very happy time, I'm afraid. But hopefully it will shed some light on the political tumult in the United States that's reverberating around the world at the moment. What I'm going to try to do tonight in my lecture is give you a sense of what white Christian nationalism is, how it fits into the larger MAGA movement, and why I think those movements represent a grave and perhaps fatal threat to American democracy today. So imagine you probably have seen images like this at some point. These are, of course, images from the failed coup attempt on January 6th, 2021. And they're puzzling in the sense that they are really a juxtaposition of images that we might not think really go together. So you see, this Christian cross, Trump flags, American flags, symbols of racism, symbols of the American Revolution. When my co-author Sam Perry and I saw these images, we immediately knew what we were looking at. We were looking at an expression of white Christian nationalism. So what I'll try to do today is just answer a series of very basic questions. Who supports white Christian nationalism? What do white Christian nationalists believe? When did white Christian nationalism emerge? How does it fit into the MAGA movement? Why is it a danger to democracy? And finally, some reflections on whether American democracy can survive the current political crisis. This is my collaborator on my last book, The Flag and the Cross, Samuel L. Perry, and really what I'll be doing is presenting some of the analysis from that book and then updating it since it was published in 2022, now 3 years ago. So in earlier work with another political sociologist, Andrew Whitehead, a book called Taking America Back for God, Sam developed a Christian nationalism scale using a series of questions. And they were able to then assign scores to people ranking from 0 to 24, with 24 being the highest score. Some people objected that these questions were too general. They were not written specifically to research white Christian nationalism. So last year, the Public Religion Research Institute, in cooperation with the Brookings Institute, did another survey featuring a much more targeted set of questions. So this gives you some sense of how deep the support for white Christian nationalism is. Of course, the number that you attach to that level of support depends a bit on how you categorize various scores and which questions you ask, but certainly I think it's reasonable to say that it's no lower than 10% and maybe as high as 30 or 40. So it's quite significant portion of the American population. What you see here is a breakdown by religious tradition, and this chart actually tells you a great deal, particularly if you look at the top 3 lines. So you may have read or heard that over 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020, again in 2024. Here you'll see part of the explanation. White evangelical Christians are the strongest supporters of white Christian nationalism. The next 2 lines are, of course, also very interesting. You may also have read that in the 2024 election that Trump did far better amongst Hispanics and African Americans than previous Republican candidates had done. And I think, again, this sheds light on why this is. This is a similar chart, a little bit more further broken down. And here I really want you to just look at the far left line, Pentecostal. I'll have something to say about Pentecostals later on in the lecture. They're often not distinguished from evangelicals. I'll say a little bit about what sets them apart from evangelicals as well. All right, so this brings me then to the what question. What is it that this 10 to 30% of the American populace affirms? Well, one way thinking about what white Christian nationalism is a kind of political vision. That is a set of policy preferences which affect voting behavior. And if you look at the political attitudes and how they're correlated with scores on the white Christian nationalism scale, you'll find out that white Christian nationalists are for capitalism, but against social welfare, that they claim to be for family values, but they're against race mixing, they're against interracial marriage, interracial adoption, and of course immigration. They say that they're for law and order, but they're also against any kind of gun laws or gun regulation. They claim to be for the American military, but they are against international law, and I would wager many of them are against the Geneva Convention as well. So at this point you might be asking yourself, well, this just sounds an awful lot like the Republican Party's platform for the last decade or more. And so what does this really have to do with Christianity? Aren't you just putting a religious label on people's partisan political preferences. Well, another way of thinking about what white Christian nationalism is, and Aditya alluded to this in his opening comments, is as a kind of a narrative. I think it's widely accepted today, view that we all inhabit narratives, that we write stories about ourselves, we inhabit stories about our communities, about the countries that we live in, and those stories deeply inflect our view of the world and the way that we move through it. Here I'm using idea of the deep story, which is borrowed from the Berkeley sociologist Arlie Hochschild. What she's getting at with this idea of deep story is that these stories are not always fully conscious or completely articulated in our mind. There are oftentimes things that have to be, to some degree, sort of drawn out because they're sort of implicit in our understanding of the world. So the deep story of white Christian nationalism, as you can see, is roughly as follows. America was founded as a Christian nation. The American founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so on, were Orthodox Christians. The founding documents themselves, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, are based on biblical principles. Some versions, they're even thought to be divinely inspired. As a result, America is divinely favored. It has a special role to play in history. And in order to carry out that mission, it's been given unique power and prosperity. But America today is threatened. In particular, it's threatened by the presence of non-whites, non-Christians, non-native born Americans on its soil, on its borders. It must be kept white and Christian, or made so, and by whatever means necessary. You might be a little bit skeptical about the white part, but let me just give you one piece of evidence here, and there's lots more where this came from. It's a kind of a complicated graph, but what this does is it compares whites and blacks' attitudes towards racial discrimination. And the kind of executive summary is that the higher a white person scores on the Christian nationalism scale, the more likely they are to think that whites face considerable discrimination and blacks very little discrimination. Whereas a black person's score on that Christian nationalism scale has absolutely no effect on their attitudes in this regard. So this is the sense in which Christian nationalism is entwined with racial animus and racial prejudice. All right, so let me try to explain the sense in which we could think of this story, this deep story, as Christian. It's Christian in the sense that it draws on and weaves together three narratives taken from the Christian Bible. The first of these stories referred to as the promised land story. And in the story, American Christians see themselves as the historical successors to the ancient Israelites. And they see North America as their promised land, which was given to them by God. And what's more, they see those who occupy those lands as people who must be driven out or exterminated. The second strand here, the second narrative strand, is the end time story. And this is based on biblical prophecies about the end times and the second coming of Christ, which is understood in very literal terms. So if you've ever read the revelation of John, the kind of fiery battles involving angels and demons, and Jesus arriving on a white horse out of the sky, and vials of blood being poured out. Many American Christians really interpret this story quite literally, certainly as a sort of coming battle between the cosmic forces of good and evil. And needless to say, they see themselves as on the side of the good. The third strand in white Christian nationalism is what we call the racial curse story. And perhaps you'll remember the story of one of Noah's sons coming into his tent and seeing him naked, having a curse pronounced on his head. Mark was to be placed on his body, and he was to be condemned to eternal servitude. So, pro-slavery white Christian theologians refashioned or reinterpreted the story as a justification for the enslavement of African Americans. The mark on the body, why that's of course black skin, eternal servitude, that of course means chattel slavery. So when did this all come together into a coherent story? I think many people think of Christian nationalism as something that's new. They think they associate it with evangelicalism, and they associate it with the Christian right. They think this is maybe something that emerged 10 years ago, or maybe 40 years ago, maybe even in 1960. Our argument is that it emerged much, much earlier than this. You may have heard of the 1619 Project, this kind of revisionist history of the United States, which centered the arrival of the first ship carrying enslaved people from Africa. We call white Christian nationalism the 1690 Project, because these three strands really were woven together by Puritan theologians in New England. And what you see here is a picture of one of the most famous of them, Cotton Mather, and a book, his famous ecclesiastical history of New England, which he really weaves together these three strands into a single, relatively coherent narrative. All right, so hopefully you have some sense of what white Christian nationalism is, both as a political vision and a deep story. Let me now talk a little bit about the kind of contemporary networks that make up the movement. And I would point here to four different groups: conservative evangelicals, neo-integralist Catholics, Christian Reconstructionalists, and non-denominational Pentecostals. So, in some ways, the oldest of these groups, the white Christians, are white evangelicals. They really were the backbone of the religious right in the United States from the late 1970s onwards. And some of the really sort of key players in this movement are Faith and Freedom Coalition, led by Ralph Reed, that engages in voter outreach and voter mobilization. The Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States still, 12-14% of the population, which forces a very conservative fundamentalist interpretation of Christian theology and morality. And last but not least, the Family Research Council, headquartered in Colorado, which is kind of a policy think tank, and translates a lot of the views of the SBC into concrete policy proposals, which it lobbies Congress for. Newer entrants here are the Catholic integralists, kind Conservative Catholics have been part of the religious right from the very beginning, though they've often played a less publicly prominent role because of continued anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. But in recent years, they've taken a turn towards Catholic integralism. And this is essentially the idea that state and church should work hand in hand. It should not be separated, and the church should cooperate with the state in imposing a particular vision of the moral and social order on the population, whether they like it or not. Just to give you a taste of what they mean by this, a lot of these folks think of Franco's Spain and Salazar's Portugal as not sort of warning examples, but as utopian projects to be resurrected. You probably have heard of Opus Dei, the somewhat secretive Catholic lay organization. They have a very large and very active recruiting operation in Washington, D.C. I would be willing to make a bet that J.D. Vance is a member. Catholic Bishops' Conference, a little bit more complicated in their views, but they certainly have continued to make abortion the absolute #1 issue in their political statements. And then, last but not least, a kind of a highbrow Catholic journal headquartered in New York called First Things, and they really, I think, are the ones who really have are kind of the brain trust of this entire operation. All right, here's a group you probably have not heard of. Christian Reconstruction. This is a movement that has its roots in neo-Orthodox Calvinism, not of the Genevan variety so much as the sort of Netherlandish variety, and had a tremendous influence on a group of theologians centered around Princeton in the early 20th century. Christian Macon was one of them, and sort of their kind of Thomas Aquinas, if you will, is a man named John Rushdoony, an Armenian convert to Calvinism, who develops a couple of very important concepts. One is the idea of dominion, which is the idea that Christians are commanded to rule over all aspects of society and over all non-Christians. And theonomy, that in doing so, that they should base the social order on biblical law, by which they mean Old Testament law, by which they mean, yes, every letter of Leviticus. Sort of modern leader of this movement is a man named Doug Wilson, who lives in Idaho, where he started a network of churches throughout the United States, runs a publishing house, publishes popular novels, has a very popular YouTube channel and podcast. Out there in Idaho, they are building what they call the Great Readout, REDOUBT, which is to be a kind of a civilizational remnant after the collapse of the United States, in which they will rebuild a Christian society while they await the end of the world. Finally, we come to the Pentecostals. It's hard to draw a really hard and sharp line between Pentecostalism and evangelicalism, but there are some important differences. So one is that Pentecostals advocate a charismatic or spirit-filled understanding of Christianity. They believe in faith healing, they believe in speaking in tongues, many of them believe in the so-called prosperity gospel. Many Pentecostals most are non-denominational, so that they don't belong to a particular denomination. The one that I want to focus on here, the NAR, also known as the New Apostolic Reformation, is really in some ways the sort of bleeding edge the storm troops of the religious right today. So they believe that they're led by a self-appointed circle of so-called apostles, people who see themselves as direct successors of the New Testament apostles, people possessed of unique spiritual gifts and powers. They believe that they and their followers are engaged in spiritual warfare. That is, they have a very supernaturalistic view of the world. They believe that the forces of good and evil are around us all the time, fighting with each other all the time, and that they must actively engage in this combat. Just to show you how literally they take this, a little bit of swag here. So you'll see the little Bible holster, and then there's, my favorite though was the shofar holster. The shofar is the ceremonial ram's horn. You need to have that at the ready, in case you are going to engage in spiritual warfare. And here's one of the most influential memes that you probably have never seen. Remember, I mentioned earlier this idea of dominion, and this is a kind of elaboration of that theory of dominion. This is the idea that there are these 7 spheres or mountains of social influence, and that it is the duty of all believing Christians to conquer the commanding heights of the 7 mountains and to rule over society. Here's a kind of a nerdy sociology footnote. So the guy who came up with this idea of the 7 mountains originally is a theologian named C. Peter Wagner, and he was inspired directly by his reading of MAGA. Happy to say more about that later, but can't make this up sometimes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what I'm going to call the sort of fellow travelers, the kind of other elements of the MAGA movement. Because let's be clear, white Christian nationalism is not the whole of the MAGA movement. It's a very important component of it, but by no means the only one. But here are, in my view, kind of the 4 kind of key other components of the core group of MAGA. So first is the technocratic oligarchs. Oligarch, if you haven't encountered that formulation, it's a combination of oligarch and bro. Brother, bro being a particular kind of hyper-masculine young man, at least or maybe a middle-aged man who wants to be hyper-masculine. And these are all these guys, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Eric Andreessen, they have various things in common. One is that they made a ton of money in Silicon Valley, mostly originally from the development and sale of PayPal, the payment system used by eBay. But the first 3 of them also have, interestingly, in common that they all spent a lot of their youth in South Africa. And I'd be happy to say more about why I think that was important, but I think you probably can guess without my saying too much more. The other is the online manosphere, very important because a lot of young men, there's a huge gender gap in American politics today, and a lot of young men are trending towards the Republican Party. And here you see sort of a range, from relatively benign podcaster Joe Rogan, who mostly spends his time, kind of hawking fitness, fitness stuff and, vitamin cures, to a somewhat more sinister figure, Andy Tate. And they play a very important role in recruiting young men. Another aspect here I think is important is sort of what I would call elite pronatalists. These are people who think that people, or at least some people, should have lots of kids. And this is indeed a phenomenon on the religious right. It's sort of a mark of status and honor if you have 8, 9, 10, 12 kids, and ideally so-called trad wife or traditionalist wife to go along with that. Just not entirely random, the sociologists Brad Wilcox and New York Times commentator Ross Dowdett are relatively prominent intellectual pronatalist into life. And then last but not least, the armed militias, you know, the folks who really were behind the failed coup attempt on January 6th. These are sort of violent militia groups, and you know, many of whom were pardoned by Donald Trump after he took office. All right, so again, kind of taking the long view here for just a moment, like, why are we seeing this incredible upsurge of white Christian nationalism in the United States right now? So in looking over the longer history of this movement, I've identified kind of 4 common catalysts, which in the past have led to upsurges of white Christian nationalism. As you can see, wars against ethnocultural others, periods of mass immigration, times of economic crisis, movements of Black empowerment. So for those of you keeping score at home, we've seen all 4 of those over the last 2 decades. So in essence, we really should not be terribly surprised. I think one of the things that is new about this latest instantiation of it, there are various things, but one of the things that's new about it is a sense of grievance and an opposition, increasing opposition to liberal democracy. And in order to understand why that is, one of the key things here is quite simply the decline of organized Christianity within the United States. 20 years ago, the United States still seemed to be an exception to secularization in the sense of declines in church-going and religious belief. Not anymore. Not anymore. Today, the number of people who have no religious affiliation is greater than the number of people who are evangelicals. That is a really quite profound shift. And those numbers are even higher amongst younger age cohorts. So people in their teens and 20s, where you'll see figures as high as 40% for religious non-affiliation. All right, so wasn't that long ago, in 2020, the white Christian nationalists were outside of the halls of power, trying to break in. They were trying to break in to the United States Congress. Well, they're not outside anymore. I'll just point to 3 very important examples here. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, who is an avowed Christian nationalist. Russell Watt, who runs the Office of Management and Budget. He's the guy really who is most responsible for all of the funding cuts that are going on. That because he understands how to run the books, how to prevent the checks from being written, the money from going out. And last but not least, Pete Hegseth, former Weekend Fox News commentator, now in charge of the largest military in the world. Let me just let's do a little bit of a deeper dive here with Mr. Hegseth. He's a very manly man, as you can see. He has a lot of tattoos, which he's quite happy to show people, right? So the symbols are not just on flags or on banners, but they're actually all over his body. And I'm just going to sort of very quickly run through a couple of these so you'll have a sense of the iconography here. So on his chest, in the lower photo, that is so-called Crusaders or Jerusalem cross. It was, in fact, actually carried into battle. It's associated historically with the order known as the Knights Templar, which was one of the Jerusalem crusading orders, which has a kind of a mythical status amongst conservative Christian men in particular in the United States. the Latin term on his bulging bicep there, Deus Vult. God wills it. This was the battle cry of the Crusaders. This does not show his most recent tattoo, which is immediately below Deus Vult, and that is kafir in Arabic letters, heretic, right? So, I mean, there you have, in a sense, this association between kind of warrior Christianity and anti-Muslim sentiment. There are also a whole series of other tattoos, which are perhaps not quite so clear here, that are associated with the American Revolution and with various militia groups. So that's Pete Hegseth, our current Secretary of Defense. All right, so what should we make of this? What exactly is it that is emerging at the moment? So the leaders of the MAGA movement have been quite clear that what they want is regime change, their language. What kind of regime exactly is it that's emerging? I'm not sure yet, but let's run through some of the diagnoses and descriptions that have been given. So one is competitive authoritarianism. This is a system in which elections continue to be held, but the opposition is either at a disadvantage or the elections are purely ceremonial. So you might think of Erdogan's Turkey for the first example, or Putin's Russia for the second. They're elections, but they're neither free nor fair. Second diagnosis is illiberal democracy. Well, there's still democracy in the sense of popular sovereignty, perhaps also elections, but not liberal democracy. And by liberal democracy, I mean a democracy in particular that affirms individual rights and the rule of law. So if you've been following the legal tussling around the disappearances of various people from the United States, you'll see that rule of law is currently being very severely challenged. Another diagnosis is right-wing populism. So, populism is a term that also gets applied to maybe right-wing and far-right movements in Europe and South and North America as well. This is another kind of story about politics, one in which a pure people is being exploited by a corrupt elite for the benefit of some outsider, migrants, cultural, religious, racial others. Oligarchy. Now, there's an old one. We've already encountered the term oligarchy. This was one of the things that Republican theorists in classical Greece and Rome, also in Renaissance Italy, worried a great deal about, that the accumulation of private wealth and power could become a threat to free and to Republican self-government. Indeed, that it was almost an inevitable follow-on. Last and most controversially, fascism. If you've ever delved into the literature on fascism, you know that there are many different definitions, and it's not the place to sort of delve into them. But one thing that when there was debate about this, whether Trumpism was fascism, during the first Trump administration, one thing that really struck me that was missing was techno-futurism. Backward-looking, hyper-nationalist, racist, check. But Italian fascism and also German Nazism also had a techno-futurist element. So Italian futurists were very important. Their sort of worship of power and speed and technology, violence, right, was very important to Italian fascism, and I think it's more important than we understood until quite recently to German Nazism as well, when we learned that the shock troops were literally taking speed out on the front lines. So I think there's something to each of these different diagnoses, and taken together, I think the question you have to ask yourself is whether this is not really a death sentence for American democracy. The scale of the challenges here is absolutely enormous. Securing free and fair elections, defending individual rights and the rule of law, preventing government corruption, addressing massive accumulations of wealth and social inequality, countering hyper-nationalism and techno-utopianism. That is a pretty tall order. My own sense at the moment, and I'll close with this, is that the greatest danger to Trumpism at the moment is Trump himself. And the thing that is most likely to bring him down is his own crazy terror policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much. We have absolutely riveting and fascinating and disturbing, and we have about 35 minutes to take some questions, thoughts in the room, but straight off the back.
Yeah, so two things. Oh, there's so much.
And there's a roaming mic.
Where to start? First of all, I actually disagree with your assessment that Trump is his own worst factor. If you lots of reports saying that his approval ratings are going down, but if you look at his Republican approval ratings, they're still over 90%. And I would say I agree 100% with the premise. I think, and some of my colleagues here will tell you, I've been talking about this white Christian nationalism for a while now, and that Democrats are not facing up to this for some reason. Maybe you could address that point. But I think the ultimate absolute, what I call the strong nuclear bond between Trump and the white nationalists and the travelers, the underlying theme is white supremacy. Trump is a visceral white supremacist whose basic message is it's okay to be white supremacist. Actually, it's necessary because we are becoming a smaller percentage of the United States. And they love him for that. So I can go on. I'll stop there.
Would you like to respond or take a few more?
Sure. I mean, I don't really disagree with you. I think, as I try to make clear, I think white supremacism is absolutely a core element of Trump's appeal. I mean, the thing that is, however, still a little puzzling is the amount of non-white support that he gets. And I do think that the Christian nationalist rhetoric does at least help shed some light on that.
I'm sorry, I don't agree with the one non-white support, but that's puzzling. Could you expand on that? And the reason I say that is 92% of black women voted for Trump, for the Democrats, Harris, 80% of black men. And people point out that Latinos, majority men voted for Trump. But what people, and this drives me crazy with the Democrats, because they describe Latinos as people of color. The problem is Latinos don't describe themselves as people of color, and many of them actually identify as white, and they're Roman Catholic and socially conservative and religious. Totally obvious why they're voting for Trump.
Right. Well, I mean, there is, of course, also a gender dynamic here, right? I mean, that comes out in the kind of oligarchy. And if you're interested in reading up on that, the reason I don't talk so much about it is because there's a truly outstanding book on it with possibly the best title ever, Jesus and John Wayne, by a historian named Christian Nationalism, that really traces this out in great detail.
So I really thank you. It was fascinating. And I wanted to ask something about the Christian left. Do you know of this magazine, The Sojourners? The Sojourners is an extremely active group, and they're very much into diversity and everything that Trump and the white nationalists loathe. So I just wonder what you do with those who are Christian but totally opposed. Is there any active movement or reuniting? Thank you.
I mean, there are, but they're just much smaller. So if you were to go into a kind of a liberal Protestant congregation on a Sunday morning, there would be fewer people in the pews than there are in the audience today. And like us, they would mostly have gray hair and be over 60. And this is, what's happened is just there's been a decline of liberal Protestantism over the last 50 years. And it's just not the kind of cultural force that it once was. I like to give as an illustration of this the fact that the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr appeared on the cover of Time not once but twice during the mid-20th century. He was, or the people like William Sloane Coffin, the Yale chaplain, and these were nationally renowned people, and you really can't find anybody who's quite that much of a public figure on the Christian left. I mean, that said, yes, sure, the Christian left still exists, and they are actively organizing, but they're just not as powerful or influential as they once were, and as the Christian right is now.
Thank you very much. Was cheered last weekend by the thousands of people who came out to protest, and to, particularly in Washington, large cities. I'm also always cheered when people are out trying to stop the genocide that's taking place in Gaza. I'm an activist myself, as is my husband. We live there, so we've seen the occupation firsthand. And I'm sort of appalled by the link between white Christian nationalism and the Palestinian Jesus, who was a Jew. And I wonder if there's any way that the scales can be taken off the eyes of Christians by enlightened people, or are they just out there somewhere with these agendas and this sort of rigid brain that won't countenance any sort of other way of looking at reality, especially when there have been so many people killed in the genocide, and people like Omer Bartov from Brown University and Ilan Pape and other people call it what it is. So if you could just maybe address another angle of this that's pertinent to the American scene, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. So I mean, since you've spent time there in Israel-Palestine, I'm sure you're aware of the influence of Christian Zionism within the United States, and be another lecture, but in simplest terms, Christian Zionism is the view that Christians have an obligation to support Israel, and that by Israel they understand Israel in its biblical or historic boundaries, which leaves no room for the Palestinians. So I mean that certainly is is a big piece of it. And to this I would add, I occasionally have heard conservative American Christian sort of idolizing Israel. Strong borders, strong military, real men, fighting against Muslims, right? They also think of it as a ethnically homogeneous state, just like they think of Russia as ethnically homogeneous, right? I mean, it's ridiculous, I realize that. But, they have a kind of a cartoon version of Israel that they idealize. And you put those two things together, I think it very, very difficult, to open people's eyes to what's going on there right now. I know, it's just tragic. I mean,
Excuse me, I just want to say I read a Pew survey today, and the number of people who support Israel in the United States is declining percentage-wise, and they gave the age brackets, etc. So there is hope, and we will not stop, because we can't. It's a moral obligation, as you know.
Yeah, well.
Thank you.
Good evening. I have two questions, but they're very linked, so if you don't mind, I'll ask them both. The first is, you said you were going to come back on the South African link, which you didn't do. And I also wanted to point out, concerning the South African link, that Andreessen is born American.
Andreessen is, yeah.
Yeah. And David Sachs is Jewish. So he's not part of this movement, as far as I know. The reason I want to link this to the next question is that I was wondering to what extent the fear of these people of becoming sort of declassed vis-a-vis black people is not in relationship to the DEI movement. That they have the feeling that if you're white and Christian, you have less chance getting forward in your life than if you are a minority. And if that doesn't have to do with the South African side, where since the ANC has gone into power, it's very hard for South African whites to get a good job because there's always a favoritism for the black people. So I wonder, that's why I'm asking the two questions at the same time, too, if that's what you meant or if you meant something else.
So I don't have a deep knowledge of South Africa. I'm not going to pretend that I do. So I can't really pronounce on that. But, I do know that some of these guys were in South Africa during the 70s, during the kind of final death throes of apartheid. And I do know there was actually quite a good article about a couple of weeks ago in the Atlantic about Elon Musk's grandfather and father and their departure from South Africa. And now there, I think you can really very clearly see the links, not just in his sort of eugenicist and racist views in the case of Musk, but also in his technocratic views. His grandfather was a member of a movement called the Technocracy, which believed that democracy was inadequate or a failed form of government, and that in the industrial age you needed scientists and engineers to take over administering society. And this is very clearly what Musk thinks as well.
That goes back to Plato, doesn't it?
I guess, certain version of that.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you for this amazing lecture. I really also very much liked your slides with all these numbers, sympathizers, convinced people. My question is, and you call it death to US democracy. And I'm of course worried. I think everyone's worried here. Can you put this in numbers? How many between sympathizers and convinced people these Christian nationalists are? They fit into this group, whether it's MAGA and all. And how many of those, if you have data, voted for Trump? I mean, we've got 77.3 million people who voted for Trump, and speculation is about 50 million of those are these people. Is that in the ballpark? Because if that's the case, it's going to be tough to ever get fair elections and the democracy back. My other question is, what are we going to do now?
I mean, it's as I suggested in the lectures, it is a little difficult to really, be certain about numbers, just because it depends, again, on the questions that you ask and the way that you divide people up into various groups, ambassadors or resistors or whatever. But I mean, if we say that, minimum would be, 10% of the population, and they probably vote at higher rates than other people do. I mean, sure, that gets you to 40 million people probably. That would be a kind of a low end estimate. It's very high. I mean, there is now also geographical data on this, county level data that you can, PRI has this up on their website, and you won't be surprised to see that that it's most heavily concentrated within the old Confederacy, the states of the old Confederacy, so the southern states. So it will be very difficult. I mean, the way that I talk about this with people is that, of course, it's important to focus on the next election. Of course, it's important to be concerned about national politics. But I think this is a generational project. The right got where it is today. It took them half a century to organize to the degree that they've organized. It took that long to overthrow Jim Crow. That, I think, is the kind of project that you're looking at. And so I think that the thing for people to do is just anything, but above all, get organized. I and other colleagues I know are trying to organize sort of, small pro-democracy networks. And I think those networks have to be international, because I do think that we're entering into a period of democratic recession, where the ties of democracy that spread outwards post-'89 are shrinking again. And I fear that, Western Europe will become the bulwark of democracy that the United States was during the first half of the 20th century. And so it's especially important, I think, that to sustain those transatlantic ties, as difficult as that is going to be, given the amount of antagonism that Trump and MAGA are stirring up, and their determination to destroy the transatlantic alliance, which they've already made considerable progress in doing, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for your analysis and very fascinating lecture. I'd be curious to know more on your last points on hyper-nationalism and techno-futurism, because as you said, the first Trump administration, you didn't see so much the influence of techno-futurism, and I was wondering do you see any differences now, today, compared to the first administration on this last point?
No, certainly. This kind of most obvious just in this new alliance between the MAGA movement and Silicon Valley. There's still a lot of debate about why this shift happened, but it's very clear that Silicon Valley billionaires shifted their support from the Democrats to the Republicans between 2020 and 2024. And, in part, I think this is because their business model is disruption, and Trump is an agent of disruption.
Yeah.
Their goal is to burn everything down and start over again. That's what they imagine. That's how they made their fortunes, was by burning stuff down and starting over again. And of course, this does go together in many of their cases with just extreme techno optimism. There was Mark Andreessen wrote this, trying to think of the right words, not to sort of descend into obscenities, but this screed, this sort of manifesto about a year ago, just with these outlandish views about how technology can solve all of our problems. And I do think to some degree it is a sort of interesting pattern that some of the most radical politicians tend to be engineers. And this is also true, actually, for example, of ISIS and Islamist groups as well. I think because they do think that social problems have sort of engineering solutions. But, the sort of focus on AI and, essentially, everybody saw this coming, but, the Trump administration is more or less promised to bankroll Elon's mission to Mars, right? There definitely is kind of techno-futurist dimension. I think that's even clear if you think about everything, some of the lesser-known things that Musk is doing, for example, Neuralink, right? This sort of idea of these neural implants that will make us sort of superhuman or super intelligent. So bottom line, though, is I think that, they saw Trump as somebody who could translate their business model into politics.
Yeah, I think if you could follow up on what you just said, because I was surprised that in all your lecture, you didn't mention at any point the libertarian movement and the libertarian thinker or the libertarian utopist. So maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because it seems like there is a strong link between MAGA, the white Christian nationalist, and the libertarian.
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of elite men who are very attracted to libertarian thinking in the United States, and this, of course, includes Silicon Valley, where libertarianism is very influential, but it also includes segments of Wall Street, segments of the crypto industry, who really are just opposed to state regulation of any kind. So sure, that is a link, but I think it's probably most important at the elite level. I haven't really seen serious research done on this, though. So it's I think you're right that the link is there, but I'm not sure how well understood it is at this point. I will just say one thing, which is that it's libertarian in the sense of freedom for me, but not for thee. It's just very one-sided. It's like, Elon Musk was a huge proponent of free speech until yesterday, when suddenly words like black and woman was banned.
Thank you for your talk. It's super interesting, and it's sad, but I'm curious about how do you see this as a coherent movement? Because in many ways, the story you're telling us, it's a story of people getting together and creating a type of movement to get to power, and they know what they want. But there is kind of they are very different in many ways. You could also flip the story and to say that there are differences among those different groups you are telling. So even if you think about the tech elites, part of the story you're telling is about the story of interests, but it's also a story about an ideology. So at the end of the day, if you could elaborate a bit more, if this is a story about a cultural, ideological movement getting to power, or if it is just almost an elective affinity between capitalism and things, or if you want to put it in the
Sure.
elite theory type of approach, are we talking about a power elite coming together and making a plan, or it's just an elective affinity somehow that got to power at this moment?
So there are many different ideologies within the MAGA movement, but there is no single MAGA ideology. What holds the movement together is mostly two things. Trump's charisma. I don't feel it, but some people do. And also, the construction of an other, And so I think one of the things that joins the charisma and the othering is the creation of spectacles of suffering. This is certainly has been long true of the online right, that owning the libs, liberal tiers, those were the paramount goals. More recently, you're seeing this turned into a kind of a nationalized spectacle. I imagine some of you have seen these videos of this gulag in El Salvador, this torture dungeon there, and this Christine Nationalism, the Homeland Security Secretary, showing up with her 60K Rolex and her plastic surgery and standing in front of these guys who had all been posed in particular positions. I mean, maybe Riefenstahl would be proud, right? I mean, it's really just kind of almost demonic imagery, these portrayals of suffering. So I think that's a lot of what holds it together. So of course, you are right that there are diverging interests and ideologies within the movement, and it's important, I think, strategically to understand that. The right has been very successful at attacking those divisions within the left, and people on the left need to become much more strategic in the United States about returning the favor.
Hi, thank you. My question is, how can you explain the fact that this Christian nationalism movement they're based on God, Jesus, the Bible, and then you have all of these guys and women too that are sexual offenders, rapists, criminals, liars, you name it, all the obscenities, everything that they go against the law, but they swear by God. So how can you explain that? How is that possible? How can women vote for this guy after what he's done to women? And all of these people, and they're talking about they're against abortion because they have to save lives, but they are killing millions of people like in Gaza or other places in the world. How can that go together?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't think it does, if you're asking me, but I can do my best to tell you I think it goes together in their minds. So one is that they believe that they are being persecuted, that they are being oppressed, and uniquely so. Many conservative Christians believe that Christians are the most discriminated against group in America. And so they will say, gloves off, we need a fighter, we need a protector, we need somebody who will go to battle for us. That's a very common refrain. Second thing is that a lot of people who say they're evangelicals or Christians don't know very much about Christianity or go to church very often. Yeah. Evangelical has become kind of a political label for many people. A very bizarre way in which this shows up in the data is that you will find people who say that they are Hindu or atheist or whatever, and also evangelical. Right? So to tell evangelical just means I'm a Trump supporter. That's all it means to some people. And then the last thing that I would say is that most people who do go to church go to churches that are non-denominational, that are centered around a single charismatic pastor. That pastor may have gone to divinity school, may know something about theology, or may not. It might just be a used car salesman or a former boxer or whatever. And those folks just tell the people in the pews whatever it is that they want to hear, and call it Christianity. So you put that all together, you can begin to see how people who would claim to be Christians could applaud somebody like Trump, how basically, abusing women almost seems to be a qualification these days.
Thank you. I want to get to the middle section, the middle item in MAGA, how MAGA has gained power, right-wing populism. That's certainly what Trump appealed to in great extent, and that allowed him to gain other votes than just the white Christian nationalists, many more, I think. And they kept screaming about the coastal elites, the corrupt elites, as you say, who don't pay attention to our needs and our values. Do you find it as ironic as I do that now they voted for a man and a whole administration who is absolutely the most corrupt of any financially corrupt of any in American history, and is growing by the day? It's just brazen what they're doing, but this probably doesn't matter to their followers, right? It's just Trump being a good businessman. I mean, I find that totally ironic.
Yeah, well, me too. First thing is just some folks, they're in this information bubble that's just very different from the world that we inhabit. And, you know, the sort of things that they understand as facts are not things that we would recognize as facts. But I think there is also a kind of a vicarious pleasure that they derive from seeing, somebody whom they identify with exert that kind of power and domination over others. This kind of the small man reveling in the power and violence exerted by the big man with whom he's identifying. It's the kids the little kid standing behind the big bully in the schoolyard and cheering him on. I think there's a lot of that. And there's this is psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I think there definitely are psychological dimensions to what's going on as well. But yeah, I know it is unbelievable. I mean, the working man's party, with the co-president who's the richest man in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's quite enlightening and terrifying, of course. I was wondering about the judicial power. In a democracy, it usually provides a critical check and balance to the executive and the legislative power. We know about the Supreme Court, of course, but I'm not quite knowledgeable about to what extent it's been infiltrated by this movement. Please.
Yeah, I mean, the checks and balances are not working very well. I think we can see that very clearly now. The Supreme Court, I think, is trying to walk a very tight line. It does not want a confrontation with Trump, but it wants to uphold its legitimacy. And what it's been doing, I'm not a legal scholar, but my sense of what it's doing is it's always moving towards more abstract issues. So you see this in this most recent decision about the deportations, where it becomes a question about legal standing in court as opposed to whether or not the Alien Enemies Act is appropriate in this case. As for the Republican Party, at least the congressional delegation is so thoroughly under Trump's thumb at this point, it's still difficult for me to imagine them opposing him. I think his approval rating would have to get into the low 30s or high 20s. And his floor seems to be 40%. So I'm just not optimistic. I think you really, at this point, you have to look to civil society. That's, why I said it's more like the battle against Jim Crow, where it will take a generation of on-the-ground organizing, really to push back. But I'd be happy to be proven wrong.
Yes, thank you again. To come back to this point about the hypocrisy of white Christian nationalism, and I think, and the book you mentioned, Professor Gorski, which was Jesus and John Wayne, goes a long way to explain that. Written by a former evangelical believer who left that faith. It actually talks about and explains very clearly the idea of muscular Christianity, which is that they actually reject the Jesus in the New Testament because he's a wimp. He doesn't resist. He doesn't carry weapons. He turns the other cheek. This is not the model they want. The model they want, and Professor Gorski, you mentioned this, which is the image of Christ at the second coming in Revelation. It's one line in Revelations about Christ returning on a horse with a bloody tunic, wielding a sword, and coming to condemn the people and coming for retribution. That's the Christ they embrace. And if you listen to their dialogue, that is the Christ that they believe in. So that's so they reject the Christ that we know. Yeah.
A couple of questions.
Sure. Sure.
Does I have the mic? I'll come to you.
Sorry, should I be handing it to someone?
A few questions together, so it's okay.
Oh, I don't understand. Should I go or not?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I just wanted to ask about, so if we think about his popularity, and you said, getting below the floor of 40, what do you think then, considering how his supporters consider Jesus and consider him being a fighter, what do you think would bring him down in popularity? Obviously, it's not, the things that we're talking about, the fact that he assaults women or whatever doesn't seem to resonate with them. So what do you think would resonate with them? Would it be this sort of effeminate Christ that making him appear aligned to that? Or what do you think has hold on them? Is it just not being strong? Is that the only way to make him less popular?
There are a couple of hands at the back. Please, if you can identify yourselves. Yeah, right.
In your work, have you seen any instances or movements where Christians who do not support this movement and ideology of white Christian nationalism have tried to dissent against it? And if so, or if not, why do you think that's the case?
Sojourners.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yes, thank you so much. I really, really appreciated your presentation. I just had two questions, actually. One is, do you think this whole the trade that is happening now, the global trade disruption, and once, a lot of Americans will be suffering economically, do you think this could have an impact on his popularity? And then the other question I had is, do you see any Democrats in the wings that could have any power that could disrupt the Trump administration?
Okay, I think, yeah, please.
Good question. 10% unemployment and 10% inflation, that might loosen Trump's hold over some folks. I mean, there were, a fair number of low information voters who just wanted him to get inflation down.
Yeah.
And that's not what's going to happen. I mean, that's clearly not what's going to happen. So that was what I really meant in the closing talk, that, right now Trump might be his own worst enemy with this tariff policy. But, of course, the other possibility is that authoritarians use crises to consolidate their power. So he might successfully blame the crisis on migrants or foreigners or whatever, right? So, I mean, I think one should be a little bit careful about wishing for an economic meltdown, as a way of getting rid of Trump, also because of the effects it would have elsewhere in the world. In terms of, are there other Christians opposing Trump? Oh, absolutely. Very prominent ones, in fact, and not just liberal Christians. I mean, very theologically conservative Christians. Two people whom I would point to in particular are David French, a very prominent Christian lawyer, writes a very good column for the New York Times, very sharp-eyed. Peter Wenner, Wehner, W-E-H-N-E-R, writes for The Atlantic, similar. And I shouldn't forget Russell Moore, who was very prominent in the Southern Baptist Coalition Convention until he was run out for his opposition to statements against racism. Interestingly, that is a connecting thread amongst them, is David French has several non-white adopted children, and so has a sort of more visceral sense of racism in America than many white evangelicals do. So yes, no, absolutely, there are prominent voices, for sure. To which I would also add that, many formerly neoconservative Jewish, pundits and intellectuals are ardently anti-Trump. We point to David Frum, who was George W. Bush's speechwriter, and to Bill Kristol, who was Dan Quayle's advisor and editor of the Weekly Standard. So plenty, absolutely. Last question. Remind me again.
Popularity. What would bring his popularity down with them in particular?
I answered the question. I mean, right now, the only thing I really see that would. So I think 40% is be very difficult to really break through that floor, and real economic downturn is probably the only thing that might do it. But again, I'm a little fearful of wishing for that because it can turn out very differently and very badly.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for, and I think it was a wonderful talk, deeply sobering, disturbing, but I suppose I'm particularly left with the very big other question, and that is, what is the deep story of secular, left, liberal, democratic American politics? And perhaps that deep story now needs telling, and it might be a book-length endeavor, but how could we not see this coming? Might be a good way to start that book. So please, I would invite you to join us all.
Thank you very much.